who saw in the establishment of a colony for former slaves a means of ending the slave trade, and eventually slavery itself. During the American Revolutionary War, African slaves in the American colonies were promised freedom if they sided with the British. Many did, fighting valiantly. When the war ended, several hundred of these fighters gathered their families and fled the country with the departing British troops. After some wandering, they were settled with British backing along the coast of West Africa in what is now the country of Sierra Leone. Although most of those first early settlers perished of malaria and yellow fever, subsequent attempts at settlement took firmer hold. The first of these was established in 1792. The settlers called their new city Freetown. Meanwhile, a similar conversation was taking place across the pond in the newly born United States of America. Paul Cuffey was the freeborn son of a former slave father and a Native American mother. A prominent Quaker, Cuffey became a sailor and successful shipowner who opened the first integrated school in Massachusetts and later began advocating to settle freed slaves in Africa. In 1816, at his own expense, but with the backing of the British government and some members of the U.S. Congress, Captain Cuffey took 38 American blacks to Freetown and settled them there. He intended to make this voyage an annual affair, but his untimely death in 1817 put an end to his plans. Still, Cuffey had reached a large audience with his pro-colonization arguments. Not all supporters of the idea, however, had arrived at their destination from the same starting point. Some abolitionists took up the cry as part of their attack on slavery, while some religious adherents thought the idea an excellent means of spreading Christianity to the Dark Continent. Some white Americans, considering themselves pragmatists, thought black people would simply be happier and fare better in Africa, where they could live free of the racial discrimination that gripped America. Others simply wanted to rid the new country of all black people as soon as possible. In this last group stood the statesman Thomas Jefferson. Writing in his 1781 Notes from the State of Virginia, Jefferson advocated gradually emancipating all slaves and shipping them to Africa, along with free blacks and possibly those of mixed heritage. Jefferson, an author of the American Declaration of Independence and its famous stirring words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights," was, of course, a slave owner himself. He considered black people inferior to whites and warned that their continuing presence was a threat to the young nation he had helped to found. They could not simply be freed and allowed to remain in the United States, Jefferson warned. They had to go. Among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort, he wrote. The slave, when made free, might mix without staining the blood of his master. But with us, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. This, then, was the backdrop against which the American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 in Washington, D.C. Among the founders were many prominent early American leaders, including Daniel Webster, Francis Scott Key, Henry Clay, and Bushrod Washington, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and the nephew of George Washington himself, after whom Bushrod Island in Monrovia is named. The society began raising funds to establish a colony in Africa. 4 years later, in January of 1820, the ship Elizabeth set sail from New York. On board were 86 free American blacks from New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Virginia, more than half of them women and children, along with 3 agents of the ACS. It took 6 weeks to